The air on Kepler 186f tasted of rust and regret. The locals called it dust, a name earned through the fine, crimson grit that coated every surface, seeped through every filter, and settled in the lungs of every child. It was a world of perpetual twilight under a dim red sun, a forgotten footnote in the grand, sprawling narrative of the Galactic Compact. For Elias Thorne, it was home. His world was the archive, a cavernous, climate-controlled bunker that housed the digital ghosts of humanity's expansion into this corner of the galaxy. He was an archivist, a keeper of stories, and his days were spent in the silent hum of servers, breathing air that was marginally cleaner than the planet's. He found a strange comfort in the quiet order of the data stacks, a stark contrast to the slow, managed decay of the colony outside. The Compact, in its infinite and distant wisdom, preached a gospel of stability and shared prosperity, a harmony maintained by a labyrinth of regulations and tithes that felt less like governance and more like a systematic bleeding. The Wardens, the Compact's multi-species enforcers, patrolled the settlement's corridors with a serene arrogance, their very presence a reminder of humanity's junior status. They didn't need to brandish weapons. Their authority was woven into the very fabric of the colony's existence in the ration power grids, the delayed shipments of medical supplies, and the hollow look in the eyes of the colonists. The tithes were the true weapon, ostensibly a contribution to the galactic infrastructure. They siphoned off nearly everything dust-produced rare earth metals, refined helium-3, and, most cruelly, the colony's surplus water ice, shipped off-world while the colony's own hydroponic farms withered. Elias saw the results every night when he returned to his small hab unit. His sister, Lena, would be huddled under a thin blanket, her breath a shallow, rattling thing. The doctors called it red lung, a polite term for respiratory failure caused by years of inhaling fine dust that the failing atmospheric processors couldn't scrub. The medicine she needed, a complex synthetic enzyme, was prohibitively expensive, its import tariffed into absurdity by the same compact that claimed to be protecting them. Lena's struggle was a quiet, personal echo of the colony's slow strangulation. Hope was a currency scarcer than water, and Elias was nearly bankrupt. His obsession became the compact's own history, its own laws. He reasoned that a system so obsessed with order and regulation must have a weakness buried in its own text. For months, he dove into the deepest archives, navigating terabytes of dry legalese, trade agreements, and colonial charters. He was searching for a crack, a loophole, a forgotten promise. Most of his colleagues saw it as a fool's errand, a descent into academic madness. Only Commander Eva Rostova, the colony's grizzled security chief, showed any flicker of interest, though hers was steeped in cynicism. Rostova was a veteran of the border skirmishes, a series of brief, undeclared conflicts from a generation ago that had taught humanity its place. She had seen compact diplomacy up close and knew it for the velvet glove on an iron fist. Words are their weapon of choice. Thorn, she told him once, her voice raspy from cheap synthale and a lifetime of barking orders. They'll drown you in paragraphs and subclauses until you forget you were ever angry. Still, she granted him unrestricted access to the secured historical servers, perhaps out of pity, or perhaps because a tiny, ember-like part of her hadn't been fully extinguished. One cycle, deep in the encrypted subfolders of the original First Contact Accords, he found it. It wasn't a loophole. It was a lie. The document was the unredacted founding charter, signed 4 centuries ago by the first human ambassadors and the compact's founding species. Buried deep within Article 7, Section 4 was the foundational tithe clause. It was clear, concise, and utterly damning. It stated that resource tithes could only be levied on colonies that had achieved Tier 1 sustenance, a state of complete self-sufficiency with surplus resources. More importantly, it stipulated that any colony, upon reaching this status, was to be granted a probationary seat on the Compact Council itself. Dust, like dozens of other human worlds, had been classified as Tier 1 3 centuries ago. They had been paying the tithes ever since, bled dry to maintain a status that was supposed to have empowered them. They were not partners in a galactic endeavor. They were subjects, their wealth siphoned off based on a fraudulent interpretation of the very law that bound them. They had never been given their seat. They had never even been told it was owed. The realization struck Elias not with a shout of triumph, but with the cold, silent weight of a tombstone. For 300 years, humanity had been systematically defrauded, its prosperity bled away by a lie wrapped in bureaucracy. He sat there for an hour, the holographic text shimmering in the dark, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it. This was the key. He first took his findings to Governor Madsen, a man so thoroughly beaten down by compact bureaucracy that his spine seemed to have been surgically removed. Madsen's office was one of the few places on Dust that boasted a real wood desk, a relic from Earth that served as a sad reminder of a past strength. The governor listened, his face growing paler with every word Elias spoke. He scrolled through the document on his terminal, his hands trembling slightly. When Elias finished, Madsen didn't look up. "Delete this," he whispered, his voice thin. "Commander, this is proof," Elias insisted, his voice rising with a passion he rarely showed. "They have been illegally taxing us for centuries. We are owed a seat on the council. This changes everything." Madsen finally looked up, his eyes swimming with fear. "What it changes, Mr. Thorne, is our colony's status from compliant to insurrectionist. Do you have any idea what they would do to us? They would shut off the life support to this entire planet as a budgetary correction. They would classify it as a clerical error and let us all suffocate." Elias stared, aghast. "So we do nothing. We let Lena, and thousands like her, die because we are afraid we survive," Madsen hissed, standing up. "That is all we have ever done. I am ordering you to delete this file and erase any record of your search. That is final." Elias walked out of the governor's office, the man's cowardice a bitter taste in his mouth. He passed Rostova in the corridor. She took one look at his face and knew. "He folded, didn't he?" she said, her tone flat. "He ordered me to delete it," Elias said, his voice hollow. "Are you going to?" she asked, her gaze sharp, analytical. Elias looked at her, and in that moment, the quiet archivist died. He saw Lena's face, her fight for every breath. He saw the tired, dusty faces of his fellow colonists, and he saw the serene, contemptuous expressions of the wardens. "No," he said, a new hardness in his voice. "I'm going to burn them down with it." Rostova's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "All right, Thorne, let's start a fire." Their plan was simple, desperate, and likely suicidal. Elias, with Rostova's help, would slice the original charter into encrypted data packets and broadcast it to a network of dissident journalists and sympathetic officials scattered across the human colonies. It was a truth bomb, as Rostova called it, designed to detonate simultaneously across the entire human sphere of influence, hopefully before the compact could suppress it. Rostova gathered her small, loyal security team, a handful of veterans who remembered the taste of ozone and the bitterness of defeat. They weren't soldiers preparing for a battle. They were guardians protecting a messenger. They barricaded themselves in the archive, turning the climate-controlled tomb of history into a makeshift fortress. Elias worked feverishly at a terminal, his fingers flying across the holographic keys, his mind a whirlwind of encryption protocols and network relays. The air in the archive grew thick with tension. Every ping of the proximity sensors, every flicker of the lights, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the room. They all knew the compact was listening, always listening. Their local agents, the wardens, would already have noted the governor's agitation, the security lockdown of the archive. It was only a matter of time. The first warning was a system-wide alert. A communications blackout had been imposed on the entire settlement, a standard compact procedure for civic disturbances. "They know," Rostova said, checking the charge on her pulse rifle. "They're cutting us off before they move in." Elias redoubled his efforts, the progress bar of the upload crawling across his screen with agonizing slowness. 70%, 75%. Then came the sound they had been dreading, a heavy, rhythmic clang against the archive's blast doors. "Wardens." One of Rostova's men breathed. "They're using a plasma ram." The first impact shook the entire structure, sending cascades of crimson dust from the ceiling. Elias didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the screen. 85%. Rostova stood beside him, her rifle pointed at the door. "How much longer, Thorn?" "Minutes," he gritted out. The door groaned, a spiderweb of incandescent cracks spreading from the point of impact. "We don't have minutes," she said calmly. She turned to her team. "They're coming through. Buy him his time. For the colonies." Her people took up positions, their faces set like stone. The blast door buckled inward with a deafening screech of tormented metal, and the wardens stormed in. They were a terrifying sight, a hulking, insectoid creature flanked by two silent, reptilian beings in sleek, gray armor. They moved with an unnerving grace, their weapons raised. The insectoid leader, Warden Vex, clicked its mandibles, a sound amplified into a grating approximation of speech by its translator. "Surrender the archivist. Resistance is an inefficient expenditure of biological resources." Rostova answered with a burst of pulse fire that slammed into Vex's personal shield, showering the room in sparks. The firefight was brutal and short. Rostova and her team were outmatched. Their aging equipment no match for the compact's advanced technology. But they fought with a desperate ferocity, selling their lives for seconds. Elias heard the screams, the sizzle of plasma bolts, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. He refused to look, his entire universe contracting to the glowing progress bar on his screen. 98%. A reptilian warden vaulted over a server bank, its weapon aimed at Elias's head. Before it could fire, Rostova, bleeding from a wound in her side, tackled it from behind, driving a combat knife into the soft joint of its neck. It fell with a wet gurgle. She stumbled to her feet, leaning against the terminal beside Elias. "Is it done?" She coughed, blood staining her lips, 99%. Warden Vex, its shield flickering, advanced on them, stepping over the body of one of Rostova's men. Your defiance is illogical. It buzzed. Elias ignored it. His fingers hit the final command sequence. A single word flashed on the screen in stark, green letters transmitted. He leaned back, a ragged, shaky breath escaping his lips. It was done. Warden Vex raised its weapon. A futile gesture. It declared, "Information can be erased." Elias Thorne looked up at the towering alien. The fear he had lived with his entire life, finally gone, replaced by a cold, burning certainty. He thought of Lena, and he smiled. "You can't erase the truth," he said, his voice clear and steady across the sudden silence of the archive. "You can only start a war with it." Warden Vex's weapon did not fire. The hulking insectoid lowered its plasma caster, the weapon's angry red glow receding with a soft hum. Elias Thorne stood his ground, the adrenaline of his final defiant act slowly giving way to an unnerving calm. The bodies of Rostova and her people lay around them, a testament to the brutal efficiency of the compact. Vex's mandibles clicked, a sound of dry, rustling leaves. Execution is a termination of a data stream. The warden's translator buzzed, its tone devoid of any emotion. Your data stream has just become exponentially more valuable. You are now a historical artifact. Archivist Thorne. And the compact has a great reverence for history. The reptilian wardens moved in, their movements swift and silent. One of them injected a sedative into Elias's neck, and the world dissolved into a gray, featureless fog. He didn't feel them lift him. His last conscious thought was of Rostova's face, her final and bloody smile a silent command to see this through. He woke to the taste of recycled air and the suffocating sterility of a compact holding cell. The walls, floor, and ceiling were a seamless expanse of bone-white polymer that seemed to absorb all sound. There was no bed, only a shallow depression in the floor. There was no window, only a soft, sourceless light that never changed. He was adrift in time and space, a ghost in the machine he had sought to expose. The truth bomb detonated not with a bang, but with the silent, viral spread of an idea. On Prometheus, the gleaming capital of the human colonial confederation, the data packet arrived like a whisper in a hurricane. It bypassed official channels, appearing on public news feeds, private data slates, and secure military networks simultaneously. For the first few hours, it was dismissed as a hoax, a piece of seditious propaganda from some fringe element. But the data was too clean, too precise. It contained the compact's own cryptographic signatures, layers of verification that were impossible to fake. Admiral Kalen Reed was in the command center of the HCS Defiance, flagship of the Third Fleet. When the alert came through, she was a woman carved from granite and starlight, with eyes that had seen the silent explosion of ships and the cold vacuum where friends had once been. She watched the unredacted charter scroll across her main view screen, her expression unreadable. Around her, the bridge crew murmured, their professional calm shattered. "Confirm authenticity," she ordered, her voice cutting through the rising tide of disbelief. The analysis took less than 10 minutes. Her best cryptographers, their faces pale, reported back. The document was genuine, a ghost from the archives that the compact had buried for 400 years. The lie wasn't just a lie, it was the foundational stone upon which all of human compact relations had been built. It meant every tithe, every sanction, Every condescending negotiation had been predicated on a fraud. They weren't junior partners. They were a conquered people who had simply never been told. The political fallout was immediate and chaotic. The Confederation's assembly on Prometheus devolved into a screaming match. Diplomats, their careers built on appeasing the compact, called for calm and verification through official channels, a process they knew would take years of bureaucratic stonewalling. Hardliners and populists, long silenced, now had the ultimate proof of compact treachery. They called for secession, for war. Riots erupted in the industrial sectors of Prometheus as the news spread to the general populace, the long-simmering resentment of the working class finally boiling over. They saw their short-rationed lives, their foreclosed futures, not as a product of economic necessity, but as deliberate theft. The compact's official response was swift and predictable. Through its galaxy-spanning news network, it declared the document a fabrication, a deep fake of historical records designed to destabilize the region. They branded Elias Thorne a terrorist, the leader of a violent separatist cell on a backwater world, and released carefully edited footage of the firefight in the archive, portraying Rostova's team as the aggressors and the Wardens as peacekeepers defending themselves. They were calm, reasonable, and utterly dismissive. It was a strategy that had worked for centuries. But this time, the lie was too big to hide. In his white cell, Elias had lost all track of time. Days bled into one another, marked only by the silent delivery of nutrient paste through a slot in the wall. His only visitor was Warden Vex. The insectoid would enter the cell without ceremony, its armored carapace filling the small space, and the interrogation would begin. It was not a process of physical torture. It was something far more insidious. Vex would sit, its multi-jointed limbs folded, and simply talk. It spoke of causality, of the mathematical certainty of the compact's stability. You have introduced a chaotic variable into a balanced equation. Archivist Thorne, its translator, would drone. The result is not freedom. The result is systemic collapse, death, suffering. This is the outcome you have chosen for your species. It would show him holographic images of the riots on Prometheus, of human fighting human. It showed him projections of supply chain disruptions, of food shortages on colony worlds that relied on compact trade. Look at the fire you have started. Vex buzzed. It does not warm your people, it consumes them. Was the life of your sibling worth the lives of millions, Elias would remain silent, clutching the memory of Lena's labored breathing, of Rostova's sacrifice. He knew this was a game, a psychological war to make him recant, to force him to record a statement denouncing his own findings as a fraud. He would be the tool they used to put the fire out. My sister died because your balanced equation declared her life an acceptable rounding error. Elias finally said one cycle, his voice raspy from disuse. You speak of stability, but you mean subjugation. You talk of peace, but it is the peace of the grave. You didn't just steal our resources. You stole our future. You stole our hope. Vex's mandibles clicked in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Hope is an illogical variable. It is the precursor to chaos. We gave your species order. We gave you protection from the greater threats of this galaxy, threats you cannot even comprehend. And in your infantile emotionalism, you have thrown it all away for a principle. It wasn't a principle, Elias whispered. It was the truth. The breaking point came not on Prometheus, but in the Trappist system, the colony of Horizon, a vital trade hub that processed nearly a quarter of all human interstellar commerce, was the first to act. Its governor, a pragmatic woman named Shyla Morin, had always chafed under compact rule. Armed with the irrefutable proof from Elias's broadcast, she held a colony-wide referendum. The vote was nearly unanimous. Horizon formally seceded from the Galactic Compact, declared its sovereignty, and impounded all Compact flag shipping in its starport. The Compact responded with predictable force. They dispatched a small fleet of 3 Warden-class cruisers to blockade the system, intending to starve Horizon into submission. It was a police action, a show of force to remind the unruly humans of their place. They expected a swift capitulation. They did not expect Admiral Reed. Reed had seen enough. While the politicians on Prometheus bickered, she had been quietly gathering her forces, placing the Third Fleet on high alert. The news from Trappist was the spark. Using emergency military protocols that hadn't been invoked in a century, she bypassed the assembly entirely. Her message, broadcast on a secure military channel to every ship commander in the Confederation fleet, was simple and stark. The Compact has fired on a sovereign human world. Our government is paralyzed by indecision. Our people are under attack. As of this moment, the human colonial Confederation fleet operates under my independent command. Our primary directive is the defense of all human worlds against foreign aggression. All ships are to rendezvous at the Trappist system. We are going to break that blockade. It was an act of high treason. It was also the birth of a revolution. On the bridge of the HCS Defiance, Kalen Reed watched the star charts update as ship after ship from across human space acknowledged her order, their icons turning from neutral blue to the solid, determined green of her unified fleet. For the first time in centuries, humanity's warships were moving not at the behest of the Compact, but against it. They were no longer a colonial auxiliary force. They were an armada, back in the White Room, adrift in the cold heart of a Compact battle station. Warden Vex delivered the news to Elias with an air of detached academic interest. Your people have chosen war. It buzzed, displaying a hologram of the human fleet mobilizing. A swarm of angry green lights converging on a single point in space. Admiral Kalen Reed has committed her forces to a direct confrontation. The loss of life will be substantial. The equation is now irreversibly unbalanced, all because of a single data file. Vex seemed to be waiting for a reaction, remorse, despair, a final, broken admission of guilt. But Elias felt something else entirely. He looked at the hologram, at the hundreds of ships representing millions of his people, all of them moving with a single, unified purpose. He saw the culmination of his desperate act in the dark, dusty archive. He had been a keeper of dead stories, a guardian of the past. But in that moment, he realized he had given his people a future. Rostova had not died for nothing. The fire was spreading. Warden Vex misread his silence as despair. It is a pity. It buzzed. Your species showed such potential for compliant integration. Elias finally looked up, his eyes, for the first time since his capture, burning with a cold, clear light. You're wrong, he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the sterile room. We never had potential for compliance. We have a genius for it. Vex tilted its head, its translator struggling with the unfamiliar word. Genius Elias allowed himself a grim, tired smile. "You called hope an illogical variable," he said. "You're about to find out how powerful it is when it's pointed at you like a gun." He was no longer just an archivist. He was a symbol. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the war had just begun. The Battle of Trappist was not a battle. It was a statement. When Admiral Kalen Reed's fleet dropped out of hyperspace, it did so with a brutal, coordinated precision that stunned the compact commanders. They had expected a single colonial fleet, perhaps 30 or 40 ships. They were met by over 200. Warships had answered Reed's call from every corner of human space, from the core worlds to the farthest frontier outposts. For the first time, humanity's full military might was gathered in one place, a unified fist of steel and fire. The 3 Warden cruisers blockading Horizon found themselves suddenly surrounded, their serene arrogance evaporating in the face of overwhelming odds. Their commander, a veteran prelate named Xylar, sent a frantic, coded message back to Compact High Command, a message that consisted of a single, panicked sentiment: "They are all here." Reed did not hail them. She did not offer terms. Diplomacy was the Compact's weapon, a tool used to delay, divide, and dominate. Her weapon was overwhelming force. The order, broadcast across the human fleet, was as cold and clear as the void itself: engage and destroy. The human ships, a hodgepodge of designs from a dozen different colonial shipyards, were on average smaller and less technologically advanced than their compact counterparts, but they were built for one-purpose war. They were rugged, heavily armed, and crewed by men and women who were fighting for the idea of home. The compact cruisers, by contrast, were instruments of policing designed to intimidate and disable, not to fight a peer-to-peer naval engagement. Their primary weapons were energy neutralizers and tractor beams, tools of control. The human fleet answered with a storm of kinetic slugs and nuclear-tipped missiles. The HCS Defiance, Reed's flagship, led the charge, its spinal-mounted railgun firing a tungsten spear that ripped through the shields of the lead Warden cruiser, the Vigilant Gaze, and shattered its spine. The ship broke apart in a silent, blossoming flower of fire and debris. The other 2 cruisers, the Patient Hand and the Eternal Watch, tried to scatter, but they were swarmed. Human destroyers and frigates, nimble and aggressive, moved in close, their point defense cannons chattering as they weathered the cruiser's return fire. They treated the engagement not as a stately naval duel, but as a chaotic street brawl. They disabled the cruiser's engines with targeted missile strikes and then pounded the helpless vessels into scrap. The battle was over in 20 minutes. Where 3 gleaming symbols of compact authority had once hung in space, there was now only a cloud of expanding wreckage and frozen bodies. The message to the galaxy was unambiguous. The blockade was broken. Humanity was no longer asking for its freedom. It was taking it. The victory at Trappist sent a shockwave through the Compact. In the Grand Conclave on Cygnus X1, a body that hadn't faced a genuine military crisis in 500 years, panic took root. The human uprising was no longer a regional disturbance. It was a full-blown rebellion. The hardliners, led by a stern, militaristic species known as the Glyptons, demanded a swift and overwhelming response, a punitive fleet to crush the humans and make an example of them. The more moderate factions, primarily ancient, cerebral beings who viewed warfare as a failure of logic, argued for sanctions and a renewed diplomatic effort. They could not comprehend that their diplomacy was the very thing that had started the war. For humanity, Trappist was a galvanizing moment. Worlds that had wavered now openly declared for the rebellion, their colonial defense forces flocking to join Reed's growing armada. The name Elias Thorne became a rallying cry, a symbol of the quiet truth-teller who had ignited a revolution. Songs were written about him, his likeness stenciled onto the hulls of starfighters. He had become a myth, a legend, all while locked away in a white room. In that room, Warden Vex showed him the footage. It played the battle on a continuous loop on the cell's holographic display, the human fleet's savage, coordinated attack, the silent destruction of the Warden cruisers. "This is the chaos you have unleashed." Vex's translator buzzed. "Your species is regressing to its primitive, tribal instincts. You celebrate destruction. You worship warriors." Elias watched the images, not with the horror Vex intended, but with a growing sense of awe. He saw past the violence. He saw the precision of the fleet's movements, the courage of the pilots, the sheer, unyielding will of a people who had decided they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. He saw hope forged into the shape of a warship. "You see regression," Elias said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I see evolution. We are evolving beyond you. We are learning to fight for ourselves, to speak for ourselves. You thought we were children to be managed. You are about to discover we are adults who have just remembered your name." Vex paused, its mandibles clicking softly. "Your Admiral Reed has created a symbol of defiance. The Compact understands the power of symbols. It also understands how to dismantle them." The Compact's next move was not military, but psychological. They did not dispatch a fleet to Trappist. Instead, they targeted the man who had started it all. They moved Elias Thorne from his isolated cell to a maximum security prison asteroid in a system far from human space, known only as Facility 9. And then they put him on trial. It was a show trial, broadcast on every channel across the galaxy. The charges were terrorism, sedition, and inciting interspecies violence. The courtroom was a vast, sterile amphitheater presided over by a triumvirate of judges from the Compact's most ancient and respected species. Elias was marched in, gaunt and pale from his confinement, and placed in a containment field in the center of the room. He was not given a lawyer. His defense was to be provided by a judicial adjudicator, a floating orb of light that spoke in soothing, neutral tones. Its purpose not to defend him, but to clarify the objective truth of his crimes for the audience. The prosecution, led by a sharp-tongued Glypton prosecutor named Malachor, laid out the Compact's case with ruthless efficiency. They presented Elias as a delusional fanatic, a man who had misinterpreted a historical document to satisfy his own ego. They brought forth expert human historians academics on the Compact's payroll who testified that the foundational tithe clause was a ceremonial relic, a piece of archaic legal language with no practical application in the modern era. They painted his actions as the direct cause of the riots on Prometheus and the unprovoked military aggression at Trappist. They showed images of the dead wardens, framing them as martyred peacekeepers. Throughout it all, Elias remained silent. He knew his words here were meaningless. He was a prop in a play, designed to delegitimize the rebellion in the eyes of the galaxy, and, more importantly, in the eyes of humanity itself. The trial was a message to every human colonist. This is what happens to your heroes. We do not kill them. We humiliate them. We reduce their truth to a pathetic lie. Admiral Reed and her new command council watched the trial from the bridge of the Defiance. Her strategists and political advisors urged her to denounce it, to jam the broadcast. It's a trap. Admiral, her political officer, Commander Eva Rostova's cousin, argued, they're trying to turn our greatest asset into a liability. They want to make him look like a fool and us like his violent dupes. Reed listened, her face a mask of cold fury. No, she said finally, we're not going to jam it. We're going to let every human see it. We're going to let them see exactly what the compact does to those who speak the truth. The climax of the trial came when Prosecutor Malachor approached Elias's containment field. Elias Thorne! The Glypton's voice boomed across the amphitheater. You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence of the chaos you have wrought. Do you now, before this conclave and the entire galaxy, renounce your fraudulent interpretation of the first contact accords? Do you admit that you have plunged your people into a needless war based on a lie? The camera zoomed in on Elias's face. The galaxy held its breath. This was the moment the trial had been building towards the forced confession, the public recantation that would shatter the rebellion's moral foundation. Elias looked out, not at the judges or the prosecutor, but directly into the lens of the broadcast drone hovering before him. He knew millions of his people were watching, waiting. He thought of his sister, her quiet struggle for breath. He thought of Rostova, her blood on the floor of the archive. He thought of the ships, the brave men and women who had answered Reed's call. He was no longer just an archivist. He was the keeper of their story, their reason for fighting. I do not, Elias said, his voice, though quiet, ringing with an unshakable conviction that cut through the silence of the courtroom. I renounce nothing. The document I found is the truth. The tithes you have levied for 300 years are theft. The lives you have allowed to wither on worlds like mine are murder. You speak of the chaos of war, but you ignore the quiet violence of your peace. He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. You put me on trial for starting a war. The truth is, the war began long ago. You just never had the decency to tell us we were the enemy. My only crime was reading the terms of our surrender. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Prosecutor Malachor was momentarily speechless, his script ruined. The judicial adjudicator began to emit a series of placating tones, attempting to declare his statement non-responsive, but it was too late. The message had been sent. On the Defiance, a slow smile spread across Kalen Reed's face. There's our answer, she said softly. He didn't just stand his ground, he built a fortress on it. She turned to her communications officer. Get me a line to Facility 9. It's time we delivered our verdict. While the trial had been a public spectacle, the location of Facility 9 was one of the Compact's most closely guarded secrets. But Reed's intelligence teams, composed of the best military hackers from a dozen worlds, had been working tirelessly since Elias's capture. As Elias was being dragged from the courtroom, a coded message, piggybacking on the trial's own broadcast signal, found its way to a deep cover agent, a human systems administrator working within the prison asteroid itself. The message contained a single command: transmit coordinates, await extraction. The trial had been the Compact's weapon, but Kalen Reed was about to turn it into a target. The galaxy had watched the trial of Elias Thorne. Now, they were about to witness his appeal. The raid on Facility 9 was an act of audacious insanity. The prison asteroid was located deep within Glypton-controlled space, shielded by layers of sensor nets, patrol craft, and a planetary defense grid that had never been tested in open combat. It was the Compact's dagger, hidden in the heart of its most militaristic member's territory. To attack it was not just to invite a battle, it was to declare war on the Glypton primacy itself, a species that viewed compromise as a genetic defect. Admiral Kalen Reed did not care. Elias Thorne was not merely a prisoner, he was the soul of their rebellion. Leaving him to rot in a compact prison was a political and moral impossibility. He had given them the truth. She would give him his freedom. She hand-picked a small, freaky elite task force for the mission, codenamed Operation Archivist. It would not be a fleet engagement. It would be a surgical strike, lightning fast and brutal. At its heart was the HCS Stiletto, a new prototype stealth frigate, and a squadron of Marine shock troops known as the Void Ghosts. Leading the ground team was a man who had become a legend in his own right, Major Jax Mercer. Mercer was the polar opposite of Elias Thorne. Where Elias was cerebral and quiet, Mercer was a creature of kinetic energy and controlled violence. He had earned his reputation in the frontier skirmishes, a grim-faced soldier who could turn any environment into a weapon and any battle into a victory. He saw the war not in terms of politics or history, but in terms of objectives and acceptable losses. Elias Thorne was an objective. Mercer intended to secure him. The Stiletto slipped through the Glypton sensor nets like a ghost, its hull coated in radar-absorbent plating, its heat signature masked by a complex system of thermal baffles. They dropped out of hyperspace on the far side of the system's primary moon, using its gravity well to hide their approach. The coordinates, transmitted by the human agent inside Facility 9, were burned into the ship's navigation computer. As the Stiletto began its final, silent run toward the asteroid, Major Mercer briefed his Void Ghosts in the cramped confines of the dropship bay. "This is a decapitation strike," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the hum of the ship's life support. He stood before them, clad in matte black assault armor, the skull emblem of his unit barely visible on his helmet. "We are not here to fight a protracted battle. We punch through their defenses. We grab the asset, and we are gone before they can mount a coordinated response. The intel says Thorne is being held in the sub-level detention block, Sector Gamma. We go straight there. Speed is our weapon. Surprise is our shield. No one gets left behind. Are we clear?" A chorus of "Sir." Yet, Sir saw echoed through the bay. These were the best soldiers humanity had, veterans of a dozen brushfire wars. Their loyalty absolute, their methods lethal. Inside Facility 9, Elias was back in a white room. But this one was different. After his outburst at the trial, the Compact had changed tactics. The psychological warfare had been replaced by a grim, patient waiting. They knew a rescue attempt was possible, likely even. Facility 9 was not just a prison, it was bait. And Elias was the lure. His lone guard, a towering, silent Glypton in ceremonial armor, was a constant, intimidating presence. The agent who had transmitted the coordinates, a quiet tech named Anya, had been going about her duties, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. She knew the moment the raid began would likely be her last. Her part of the plan was simple and suicidal. When the human forces breached the outer hull, she was to trigger a series of cascading power failures, crippling the facility's internal defenses and communications for a precious few minutes. The first explosion was a seismic shock that threw Elias from his cot. A series of secondary blasts followed, and the sourceless light of his cell flickered and died, replaced by the angry, pulsing red of emergency alerts. The Glypton guard straightened, its weapon raised, and moved toward the door, barking orders in its harsh, guttural language into a comlink that was now dead. The raid had begun. Major Mercer's dropship, the Breaker, didn't bother with a hangar bay. It slammed directly into the side of the asteroid, its nose-mounted plasma drill screaming as it bored through meters of rock and reinforced durasteel. The moment the hull was breached, the Void Ghosts launched. They poured into the breach, their mag boots clamping onto the corridor walls as the station's artificial gravity stuttered. The Glypton guards, caught completely by surprise, were cut down in a storm of disciplined pulse rifle fire. Mercer was the first one through. "Anya! Now!" He barked into his helmet comms. Miles away in a control substation, Anya slammed her hand down on a manual override, shorting out the primary power conduits. Lights died, automated turrets went limp, and internal blast doors failed to close. Chaos erupted throughout the facility. "Go," Mercer ordered. "Sector Gamma move. Move. Move." The Void Ghosts advanced through the darkened corridors, the green glow of their night vision optics cutting through the gloom. They moved with a terrifying speed and efficiency, a river of black armor and focused violence. Glypton resistance was fierce but uncoordinated. The guards were soldiers, but they were prison guards, accustomed to quelling riots, not repelling a full-scale military assault by elite shock troops. The Ghosts didn't break stride, engaging targets and clearing intersections with practiced, lethal grace. In the detention block, the Glypton guard standing outside Elias's cell heard the firefight approaching. It made a decision. Its orders were to prevent the prisoner's escape at all costs. It raised its weapon to fire through the cell door to execute the asset before he could be rescued. The door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by a shaped charge. The Glypton whirled, firing a burst of plasma that Mercer deflected with the armored plates on his forearm, the impact staggering him. Before the Glyton could fire again, two of Mercer's troopers stitched it with a synchronized burst of rifle fire, slamming it back against the far wall. Mercer stormed into the cell, his rifle sweeping the small space. He found Elias huddled against the back wall, momentarily blinded by the tactical lights on their weapons. Elias Thorne. Mercer's voice was a harsh rasp through his helmet speaker. Elias could only nod, his mind reeling. "Major Jax Mercer, Confederation Marines. We're your ride home." He tossed a spare sidearm to Elias. "You know how to use one of these? I'm an archivist." Elias stammered. "Point and shoot." Mercer grunted, grabbing his arm and hauling him to his feet. "Let's go. We're on the clock." They began to fight their way back to the breach point. The Glyptons, recovering from the initial shock, were beginning to mount a more organized defense. The corridors became a deadly maze of ambushes and firefights. Elias, clumsy and terrified, stayed close to Mercer, clutching the unfamiliar weight of the pistol. He watched in awe and horror as the Void Ghosts fought. They were a single organism, communicating in clipped, coded phrases, anticipating each other's movements, covering angles, and dispatching enemies with a chilling economy of motion. This was the reality of the war he had started with a single file. It was not an abstract concept. It was the smell of ozone, the percussive shock of grenades, and the sight of bodies, both human and alien, lying broken in the corridors. They were nearing the breach when a heavy blast door slammed down, cutting off their escape. It was a trap. Glypton heavy infantry, clad in bulky exoskeletons, took up positions at the far end of the corridor, their heavy repeaters spitting a wall of plasma. "They've boxed us in," one of the ghosts shouted. Mercer didn't hesitate. "Thorn, with me. Everyone else, suppressing fire." He shoved Elias behind the cover of a thick support column and unslung a heavy demolition charge from his back. "I need to get to that door," he yelled over the din of battle. "Cover me." The void ghosts laid down a blistering field of fire, forcing the Glyptons to keep their heads down. Mercer broke from cover, sprinting across the open corridor, the heavy charge in his hands. He was halfway there when a plasma bolt caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling. The charge skidded across the floor, stopping meters from the door. Mercer tried to rise, but his leg buckled. The armor plate shattered, his flesh beneath seared. "Major," a trooper yelled. In that moment, something shifted in Elias Thorne. He looked at the fallen soldier, at the Marines pinning themselves against cover, fighting and dying for him. He looked at the heavy charge lying in the open. He was the objective. He was the asset. But he was not helpless. He was an archivist. He dealt in information. And his mind, sharpened by months of psychological warfare with Warden Vex, saw not a battle, but an equation. The Glypton exoskeletons were powerful, but they were networked, sharing targeting data for maximum efficiency. Anya's sabotage had crippled the main systems, but their local battle network would still be active. Anya. Before they had left the cell, Mercer had given him a datapad with the facility's schematics. Anya had included back doors into the local network systems. He scrambled over to Mercer, who was trying to crawl toward the charge. "Give me your helmet's comlink," Elias said, his voice sharp, clear, and devoid of fear. "What?" Mercer grunted through the pain. "Do it. Connect it to this datapad." Mercer, seeing the sudden, fierce intelligence in the archivist's eyes, did as he was told. Elias's fingers flew across the datapad's surface, splicing his own device into the Void Ghost's secure battle network. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew systems. He found the Glypton's frequency, shielded by layers of military-grade encryption, but Anya had left him the key. He didn't try to break their encryption. He flooded it. He sent a massive burst of corrupted data junk code, fragments of the very historical files he had once curated, anything and everything he could think of directly into their battle network. For a critical 3 seconds, the Glypton's heads-up displays filled with garbage text. Their targeting locks failed. Their synchronized fire fell into disarray. It was the opening the Void Ghosts needed. They surged forward, their fire now precise and deadly, cutting through the disoriented heavy infantry. 2 of them grabbed the charge, slapped it onto the door, and sprinted back. Fire in the hole! The explosion was deafening. The door vanished. "Go!" Mercer roared, getting to his feet with the help of a trooper. They scrambled through the breach, back to their dropship, which was already detaching from the asteroid's hull, its engines screaming. As they lifted off, a squadron of Glypton fighters swarmed toward them. But just as they opened fire, the sleek, dark form of the HCS Stiletto decloaked behind them, its weapon ports opening. A volley of interceptor missiles turned the Glypton fighters into balls of fire on the bridge of the Defiance, miles away. Admiral Reed watched the real-time telemetry. Target acquired. Extraction is a success. Her tactical officer reported. A rare, fierce smile touched her lips. Bring them home. In the back of the rattling dropship, a medic was working on Mercer's leg. The major looked over at Elias, who was staring at his own trembling hands, the pistol feeling alien and heavy. Not bad. For an archivist, Mercer said, his voice laced with a grudging respect. Elias looked up, his eyes meeting the soldiers. He had not fired a shot, but he had fought. He had found his own weapon. The rescue of Elias Thorne was more than a military victory. It was a myth made real. The Compact had tried to turn him into a symbol of foolishness and failure. In breaking him out, humanity had turned him into a symbol of defiance, ingenuity, and the unbreakable will of a people at war. The archivist was free, and now the real war could begin. The return of Elias Thorne to the human fleet was not the triumphant arrival of a conquering hero. It was the quiet homecoming of a man who had walked through the fire and returned changed. When he stepped off the dropship onto the hangar deck of the HCS Defiance, he was no longer just the archivist who had found a file. His face, broadcast across the fleet from the trial, and now the daring rescue, had become the face of the revolution itself. Admiral Kalen Reed met him at the airlock, flanked by Major Mercer, who was leaning on a medical crutch, his jaw set against the pain. There was no grand ceremony, just a moment of profound, unspoken understanding. Reed's eyes, usually as hard and cold as the void, held a flicker of something that looked like reverence. "Welcome back, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. The word thanks feels inadequate. Elias looked at the cavernous hangar, at the soldiers and pilots who had stopped their work to watch, their faces a mixture of awe and respect. He was not a soldier or a leader, yet these hardened warriors looked at him as if he were the source of their strength. They were just words. "Admiral," he said, his voice hoarse. "You gave them a voice." The rescue from Facility 9 shattered the last vestiges of the Compact's perceived invincibility. It was a humiliating blow, a strike deep into the heart of their most feared military power. The Glyptons, enraged and shamed, unleashed their full fury. The punitive fleet they had called for was now a reality, a massive armada of warships that dwarfed the human fleet in both number and tonnage. They swept out of their home systems with one singular genocidal goal: the complete and utter eradication of the human presence in this sector of the galaxy. The war entered a new, brutal phase. It was no longer a war of skirmishes and blockades. It was a war of annihilation. Systems burned. Worlds were bombarded from orbit. The cold equations of Warden Vex were being written in fire across the stars, and the cost in human lives was staggering. Elias found a new role aboard the Defiance. He was not a strategist, but his intimate knowledge of the Compact's history and psychology was invaluable. He became a key part of Reed's command council, a quiet voice of insight among the loud voices of war. He worked with naval intelligence, poring over captured Compact data, searching for weaknesses not in their ships, but in their command structure, their supply lines, their very way of thinking. He learned that the Compact, for all its power, was a brittle thing. Its strength was its unity, a unity predicated on centuries of unchallenged dominance. Humanity's rebellion was the first real crack in that foundation in half a millennium. He discovered that the Glyptons, for all their martial prowess, were overextended. Their empire was vast, Their fleet spread thin, protecting their own borders from other, older threats. Their punitive fleet was a powerful weapon, but it was also all they had. If it could be broken, the Glyptons would have nothing left to throw at them. The turning point of the war came at a place called the Serpent's Nebula, a treacherous region of space filled with sensor-jamming dust clouds and gravitational anomalies. It was a place no sane commander would take a fleet, which was precisely why Admiral Reed chose it as her battleground. She knew she could not win a straight fight against the Glypton Armada. She had to change the rules of the engagement. It was Elias who provided the key. Sifting through ancient Glypton military doctrine, he found an obsession, a cultural blind spot, their rigid adherence to doctrinal purity. Glypton admirals were promoted based on their mastery of classic naval formations and textbook strategies. They were masters of a game that had not changed in centuries. "They're predictable," Elias told Reed, pointing to a holographic display of Glypton fleet movements. "They will always choose the most direct, honorable path. They see feints in ambushes as tactics of cowardice. They will charge straight into any trap you set, because their pride will not allow them to believe a lesser species could outwit them." The plan was Reed's masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. She divided her fleet. A smaller, faster contingent, led by the Defiance, would act as bait, luring the Glypton Armada into the densest part of the nebula. The bulk of her fleet, commanded by her trusted vice admiral, would lie in wait, hidden within the nebula's sensor shadows. Major Mercer, his leg now reinforced with a cybernetic brace, was given a critical mission. He and his Void Ghosts, aboard a flotilla of small, heavily armed corvettes, were to navigate the nebula's most dangerous passages and position themselves behind the Glypton fleet, ready to strike at their supply ships and engine sections at the critical moment. The Battle of the Serpent's Nebula was a symphony of chaos and courage. The Glypton fleet, commanded by the imperious Grand Admiral Kortak, took the bait. Seeing Reed's smaller force, he ordered a full frontal assault, his massive dreadnoughts charging forward, their weapons blazing. Reed's ships danced through the nebula, using the dust clouds for cover, inflicting stinging, harassing attacks before vanishing back into the gloom. The Glyptons, their sensors struggling with the interference, found themselves fighting ghosts. Their rigid formations began to break down in the confusing, three-dimensional terrain. On the bridge of the Defiance, Elias stood beside Reed, his eyes scanning the tactical display. He was not watching the ships. He was watching the patterns. "Kortak is getting frustrated," Elias said. "He's pushing his vanguard too hard, outstripping his support ships. He's leaving his flanks exposed." Reed nodded, a grim smile on her face. "It's time." She gave the order. From the swirling clouds of crimson and gold, the rest of the human fleet emerged, their guns opening up on the vulnerable sides of the Glypton Armada. The trap was sprung. The Glypton ships, caught completely by surprise, were thrown into chaos. At the same moment, Mercer's corvettes struck from the rear, a swarm of angry hornets disabling the engines of the Glypton dreadnoughts, leaving the behemoths adrift and helpless. The battle turned into a slaughter. The human fleet, smaller and more agile, tore into the disorganized Glypton forces. Grand Admiral Kortak, aboard his flagship the Iron Will, watched his fleet being systematically dismantled in a final act of arrogant defiance. He refused to signal a retreat. His ship was the last to fall, consumed by a volley of torpedoes from the Defiance itself. The punitive fleet was broken, the Glypton primacy, its military might shattered, its pride in ruins, was forced to sue for peace. The war was over. In the aftermath, a new galactic order began to form. The Compact, its authority broken, fractured. Species after species, long resentful of the old guard's dominance, declared their independence. A new alliance began to coalesce, one built not on subjugation, but on mutual respect and cooperation. Humanity, forged in the fires of war, was at its center. Elias Thorne, the quiet archivist from a forgotten world, was asked to be one of humanity's first ambassadors to this new galactic assembly. He stood in a chamber far grander than the one on Cygnus X1, a place built not of sterile white polymer, but of wood and stone and glass from 100 different worlds. He looked out at the faces of dozens of species, no longer subjects, but partners. His opening address was not a long, soaring speech, but a simple story. He spoke of a girl named Lena, who died because a distant, uncaring power had decided her life was not worth the cost of medicine. He spoke of a soldier named Rostova, who died defending a single, simple truth. We did not fight this war for glory or for empire, he told the assembly, his voice steady and clear. We fought for the right to tell our own story. We fought for the right to have our truths, our hopes, and our tragedies matter. The old order fell because it forgot that the galaxy is not a balance sheet to be managed, but a library of stories to be shared. Let us now, together, begin a new volume. Years later, Elias Thorne, now a respected elder statesman, returned to Kepler 186f. The world was no longer called Dust. It was now Thorne's Landing, a thriving, vibrant colony. The Crimson Grit was still there, but now it settled on bustling starports, advanced medical centers, and schools filled with the sounds of children's laughter. The air was clean, scrubbed by new generation atmospheric processors. He stood in the archive, the place where it had all begun. It was no longer a tomb of forgotten data, but a living museum, a monument to their struggle. He found the terminal where he had uploaded the file that started it all. On the screen, he typed a single new entry into the historical record. History is not a static thing to be merely preserved, he wrote. It is a weapon to be wielded, a seed to be planted. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are, and in the telling, it is the future we choose to create. He stepped outside into the twilight of the red sun. He took a deep breath of the clear, cool air, and for the first time in a long time, it did not taste of rust and regret. It tasted of home,